I wanted to discuss and explain the life and afterlife of plastics, focusing mainly on the afterlife, but just a little foray into what plastics are used for first, because of course we use a huge amount of plastics in the world now, and there's a very good reason for that. And some of the reasons for the life of the plastics being important are that life without plastics would not be life as we know it. Every single one of us, nearly every day in our lives, uses something that's made of plastic, either as packaging or something in the household, CDs, paper clips, all the things that are faded out in the background here. They're indispensable for that reason. They're considered to be wonderful by a lot of people. We love plastics. Plastics is fantastic. 3 cheers for plastics. But let's just explore the actual use of plastics and the growth in use of plastics over the years. So if you look at this graph here, right down from 1960, where very little plastic was used, this meteoric rise in plastic use in tons, millions and millions of tons per year up to 2014, and it's still growing now. So that's the use of plastics, very useful, large amounts of plastics used. Let's actually begin to look at the afterlife of plastics. What happens to plastics when we chuck them out? And I want to base this partly on a walk I made with my dogs the other day in a nice rural part of New Zealand, in 100% pure New Zealand, where there's no pollution whatsoever. And these photographs of plastic bits and pieces were just taken in the first few minutes of my walk. And just to go through them, I want to actually look at some of these in more detail as I talk later on. Here's a till receipt, and you might say, well, that's not plastic. Well, it is. It's covered with a plastic coating made out of bisphenol A, and I'll talk about that later. And you can see it nicely rotting down and releasing that bisphenol A. I don't know what some of the others are, but this is a polystyrene container from a takeaway store, I would imagine. And here's an old children's ball that's been broken into pieces sitting on the side of the road. We'll explore some of those in a little bit more detail in a moment. And of course, the longer term effect of plastics, you go to nice places in the world and you see loads of plastic sitting on the beach. But what's happening to that? It's slowly breaking down. Where's it going? And what are the implications for the environment? Let's kick off then by looking at polystyrene as an example. So there's the polystyrene food container I showed you that's on the side of our road. It's the highest production plastic in the world. In 2012, there were 32.7 million tons produced globally. That's a simply huge amount of plastic. But what is polystyrene? We need to understand a little bit about it molecularly before we can understand what might happen to it in the environment and how it might break down. So polystyrene is a polymer, as you might imagine from its name, and it's a polymer of styrene monomer units, which are joined together into a huge long chain of many monomer units. And these monomer units can either be used in this form, where it will be a transparent polystyrene, or they can be aerated and formed into little globules, which then becomes the polystyrene we're more used to seeing in some disposable cups and packaging materials. So we start off with a styrene monomer, which you can probably just about see in that bottle is a liquid, and the polymerization process produces something like this. So styrene itself, the monomer, is really quite dangerous. It's a human carcinogen, and it's been known to be a human carcinogen for a long time. And the reason for that is that styrene can be metabolized both by animals and humans and in the environment to produce this 3-carbon epoxide molecule. And that epoxide is highly reactive, and that can interact with DNA and cause mutation, which can lead to carcinogenesis. I'm not going to base anything in my talk on that, but I just want you to know the toxicity is really quite extreme. So we need to explore whether styrene is an environmental pollutant and whether it might be a problem in humans. A study in 1986 was carried out by the Environmental Protection Agency National Human Adipose Tissue Survey in the States, and it showed that 100% of fat from the samples analysed, and there were many, they weren't just a few samples, there were many samples analysed, contained styrene. So that means that styrene is a pollution issue. It is getting into people. Whether it gets into people through food packaging or through the environment, I don't know, but it's certainly there. So let's explore what might happen to styrene when it breaks down. This is mainly an environmental breakdown issue because we don't normally eat styrene, so we wouldn't normally see breakdown in the body. But you'll see where I'm going in a minute. So here's the styrene polymer with the styrene molecules all joined together. And what you might expect to happen is that these individual styrene monomers might break off from the polymer by bacterial degradation or similar in the environment, by chemical degradation, perhaps by ultraviolet light, perhaps. But that does not happen. So styrene is not released from polystyrene in the environment. But what is released is 4-phenyl valeric acid. And 4-phenolvaleric acid is pretty well non-toxic, it's safe as houses. So we don't seem to have an issue here. So where on earth can all of that styrene be coming from? So let's explore that a little bit. If you manufacture polystyrene and you form the polymer units here, if the polymerization process isn't complete, there might be, and usually are, some individual styrene monomers just lurking in between the layers of polystyrene. And then when that polystyrene is used, say, in a drink cup or in something that you put takeaway food in, the styrene might leach out into the food. Then when you eat the food, the styrene will get into your body. That's where some of that styrene comes from. Similarly, if that polystyrene is discarded, ends up in the environment, ends up in the sea, the styrene can leach out of that polystyrene to contaminate the environment. And that's another route for our exposure and animals' exposure. Interestingly, if the process for forming polystyrene is good, then most of the monomer, or nearly all of the monomer, perhaps even all of the monomer, will be incorporated. If the process isn't good, then less will. And as we change our sites of manufacturing around the world, we might be changing the way we're manufacturing, we might be changing the good practice, we might be reducing good practice, who knows? So there could well be more styrene monomer present in polystyrene products nowadays than there were in years gone by. So that's one possibility then. Styrene monomer can get into the environment, can get into our food, can get into us, and it's a carcinogen, not good news. But what else can happen to that polystyrene? And this just illustrates the leaching I was talking about just a few moments ago. Another very important thing that can happen is that the polystyrene can break down, particularly in marine environments, but not only in marine environments. This could also occur in landfill. And eventually, it can break down to very, very small particles called microplastics. Lots of people define microplastics differently. I've given a rough definition here of 1.6 micrometers, 1.6 times 10 to the minus 6 meters to 10 millimeters. So these are really quite small particles. And these small particles can end up floating around in the sea, and they do. And in fact, just in New Zealand as an example, 50%, 55% of the microplastics that we find in the marine environment are polystyrene microplastics. So lots of other plastics can break down in the same way to produce these tiny, tiny particles that sit in the environment for a very long period of time. If we explore polystyrene, particularly in that way, and think of these microparticles as being spheres of polystyrene, and all I've done is just drawn the styrene polymer sticking off the surface of its structure here. And the surface of this structure then is very hydrophobic, and it can attract non-water-loving molecules. And those non-water-loving molecules can stick to the surface, and there is where the problem is. So here, I've just shown a styrene, perhaps, molecule stuck to the surface, and a PCB, and a DDT molecule. All hydrophobic molecules can all be stuck to the surface of these microparticles. These microparticles, again, can move around the oceans, they move around with the currents, and in certain parts of the ocean where there are vortices of currents, huge tonnages of these particles exist, and they can cause very major environmental issues. I want you to explore what those environmental issues might be. And these are just two examples, there are many more. Animals that filter, like a mussel here, they will actually filter in the particles, and you can probably just about see I've got all my little molecules stuck on the outside of the particles here. They'll filter them in, and they'll stay in the mussel, and they therefore then contaminate the mussel. The molecules stuck on the surface of those particles, the really toxic molecules like PCBs and DDT, could then leach out into the creature and might affect that creature's biochemistry. And also, of course, we might eat moule marinier or something like this with some nice chips in a Belgian restaurant, and we will then get a dose of all those things in our muscle. And you may think that's not the case. Well, it is. And you can show really clearly that microparticles of plastics are present in mussels and other filtering creatures. Similarly, if a fish comes along and it decides to eat some of these microparticles, and here we've got the microparticles with the other molecules stuck to the surface, the fish eats them, but this is really quite different. The molecules stuck to the surface of the microparticles leach off and stick to the tissues of the fish because they're hydrophobic and the fish is fairly fatty, and so these molecules stay behind. And out in the feces come the microparticles for another cycle around. But the fish then is contaminated with the chemicals that were on the microparticles. We might then eat the fish as fish and chips, and if we do that, we get a dose of the chemicals that were originally on the microparticles. And why this is so important is that these microparticles are vectors for pollution, so they can pick pollution up in one place and take it somewhere else. And if it's all going into one big vortex in the ocean, we're concentrating the pollution in those parts of the ocean. And this isn't the end of the story, because plasticizers are also used to modify plastics. And in the polystyrene example, again looking at that polystyrene structure with the polymer and the individual styrene monomers sitting there, if you put plasticizers, chemicals into this, they can combine those layers and make the polystyrene stronger. So for example, in the sort of transparent drinking cups that are sometimes given to you in takeaways or in bars, these are made of polystyrene and they will have plasticizers. And one of the commonest plasticizers is a tris-4-nonylphenol phosphite. And this molecule, you can see the structure of it here, can actually, and I'll show you in a minute, can actually sit between the individual parts of the polystyrene composite. So this is just my interpretation of that. It's not chemically correct, I don't think. But you can see look, the long side chains, the 9 carbon side chains are sticking there, and they're holding together different parts of that molecule to give it quite different properties. But of course, in an environmental situation, those monomers can leach out. And as well as the monomers leaching out, you can get the plasticizer leaching out as well. And that plasticizer can then be metabolized so that the 3 non-alphenol groups with a phosphate in the middle can be metabolized to produce 3 non-alphenols. And there lies a very important environmental pollution story, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But before I tell you about that, let's look at what happens in the environment with those molecules. So non-alphenol can be metabolized by bacteria in the sediments and also by fish and by humans. We all do the same. To hydroxylate it at the end here, so it produces a hydroxy non-alphenol. That hydroxy non-alphenol can then refold into a different shape. This is fiction, because it can be in any shape. It's revolving all the time. But it's possible to get it into this shape. And if it goes into this shape, it has a degree of similarity to the female hormone 17-beta estradiol. And if you look, it's got a hydroxyl group on a benzene ring at this end. That's got a hydroxyl group on a benzene ring at this end. And at this end, it's got a hydroxyl group which is aliphatic. And at this end, it's got a hydroxyl group that's aliphatic. So in theory, that could fit in to the receptor site that binds to 17-beta estradiol and fool the cell into thinking it's a female. And you can see that more clearly if you superimpose the two, and you can see these wonderful alignment. And a compound that behaves like this is called an estrogen or a xenoestrogen, and non-alphenol is one of the most profound environmental xenoestrogens. And in fact, non-alphenol is being banned now worldwide in many uses for just that reason. Let's just look at the estrogen receptor for a few moments so that I can show you exactly how these things work, because there are some other estrogenic compounds that are produced by plastics. And this is a big issue with plastics that I want to tell you about in a few minutes' time. So here's a representation of the estrogen receptor, which is taken from an X-ray crystallograph. So this is the real estrogen receptor reduced to its individual amino acids. It's a huge protein, of course. And this crystal was formed with the estrogen receptor containing the female hormone estrogen. So you can see estrogen sitting in there. And if we magnify that a great deal, then you can see the estrogen molecule sitting between the individual protein components of the receptor. And if you magnify that even further, and I won't go into the details here, but you just need to be able to see that these things interact specifically, here's the important bit of the estrogen receptor, the hormone binding cleft. And there are particular bonds, hydrogen bonds, formed between individual amino acids at both ends of the molecule. And at this end of the molecule, there's a water molecule involved as well. And if these interactions occur, then it causes a change in these parts of the protein which pull it together. And when it pulls it together, that initiates a cascade of effects which changes the way that DNA produces, regulates its genes, which feminizes the cell. And if another molecule fitted into there as well, and you'll probably see where I'm going with this, if another molecule fitted in there, it would cause the same sort of effects. To distill that down to pure basics, imagine this is the estrogen receptor. What you need for a molecule to fit into the estrogen receptor is a hydroxyl group on a benzene ring, as I showed earlier, and a hydroxyl group on an aliphatic ring, which I showed earlier, and a long region of hydrophobicity or water repulsion in the middle, and that would cause an estrogenic response. If you look at non-alphenol, can refold, as I said, to form the same shape as the estrogen molecule. I need to explain what this is because it's quite a complex picture. The blue, the green, and the grey are the three most likely conformational forms of the hydroxy version of non-alphenol, and the brown-coloured thing in the middle is 17-beta estradiol. But these are actually all sitting in a crystal of the estrogen receptor. But I've removed all of the structure from around the side because it's too complex. You wouldn't see this clearly if all of those amino acids were there. And you can see really well that all the hydroxyl groups are in around about the same position, and the hydrophobic regions are all in around about the same position, which is why non-alphenol is profoundly estrogenic. So that's one example of a story around a particular plastic, polystyrene, which leads to a myriad environmental effects via a whole series of different mechanisms. And they all add up to quite a profound effect on the environment. Another example is that ball I showed you that was on the side of the road. I've got a feeling it was one of our dog's balls originally, so I'm quite embarrassed about this. That's made from polyvinyl chloride, PVC. And polyvinyl chloride contains the plasticizer dibutyl phthalate, and this is something that my research group do a great deal of work on. And dibutyl phthalate is also estrogenic, but for very different reasons. And let's have a look why it's estrogenic. And I think the idea is beginning to emerge here that these molecules in the environment are having effects that can be quite profound and very long-lasting. I need to just take you back to the male hormones here, but you'll see the relevance of that in an estrogenic context in a few minutes' time. Don't worry about the complexity of the slide. There's just one thing I want to show you, and that's the male hormone testosterone and the female hormone estrogen, 17-beta estradiol, and testosterone is converted to estrogen in women, but it's not converted to estrogen very well in men. Testosterone itself is synthesized from 7-alpha-hydroxypregnenolone, catalyzed by an enzyme, hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. The genes that control these production of these enzymes we understand very well, and in my lab we work quite a lot on these. And dibutyl phthalate has a profound effect on these genes. It downregulates the gene to make testosterone and upregulates the gene to break down testosterone to estrogen. So for a bloke, that's pretty bad news because you're reducing the testosterone level and increasing the estrogen level, which is why dibutyl phthalate behaves like an estrogenic compound because it's changing that balance, all-important balance of hormones. So basically, we're at a situation of cellular feminization here, going from a masculinized cell to a feminized cell. And that's all theory. It's lovely. I can do this in cultured cells in my lab. But what does it all mean? And this slide just shows some events that are happening in the environment so that you know that I'm not just telling you stories, but there's some truth behind all of this. This is supposed to represent young women in puberty, and girls around the world now are going into puberty very much earlier. The mean puberty in some parts of the world, particularly in Asia now, is somewhere in the region of 7 to 9 years, which is unbelievable. It's decreasing throughout the world, and that's because estrogen stimulates puberty. It's turned on naturally in human development at a certain age, about 10, 11, or 12. But of course, if there are estrogenic compounds in the environment, it's turned on earlier, which explains that. Male trout and salmon are producing a protein called vitellogenin, and that's the female egg protein. They shouldn't be producing that. And that's produced in response to estrogen. Male alligators' penises are decreasing in length, and the development of the male genitalia is controlled by testosterone. And if you increase the ratio of testosterone to, decrease the ratio of testosterone to estrogen, then you change the development of the genitalia. The human sperm count is going down. Work of Carlson back in the 1990s, no one knew why at the time. And we now are almost certain the reason is exposure to estrogenic compounds, mainly from plastics in the environment. And finally, there are many more examples, oysters aren't breeding as well. And why they're not breeding as well is they're able to change sex. And they change to female in response to female hormones. So if the environment has female hormone lookalikes, hormone mimics, xenoestrogens in it, then they will change sex and the ratio of males to females will change and their breeding success rate will go down. So these are real examples of what might be being caused by the chemicals I discussed earlier. Another example, just to prove there aren't any two of them, I could go on forever with these, but I won't have any more examples after this. Polycarbonate plastics used for making hard drinking bottles, for coating till receipts, the one I showed you earlier when I walked the dogs, for making the sort of greenhouse I've got in my garden with the plastic glass, for making CDs, and polycarbonate plastics are made from a monomer called bisphenol A. And bisphenol A is a really very important estrogenic compound. And I just read today that Europe is considering reducing the use of bisphenol A very significantly for these reasons. So let's look at bisphenol A and compare it with 17-beta estradiol. And just looking at it, you can see it's got a hydroxyl group on a benzene ring here. It's got another hydroxyl group on a benzene ring here, which is not ideal because we'd prefer it to make it estrogenic to be on a non-aromatic system, but that doesn't matter too much. And if you superimpose the two, you can see that these hydroxyl groups line up really rather well. And in fact, bisphenol A is a very profound estrogen. And just to prove the point that there is very great world interest in this, the WHO, the World Health Organization, and UNEP produced a report in 2013 on endocrine disrupting chemicals, the state of the art in 2012. And this lists at least 800 molecules that can be isolated from the environment, most of them originating from plastics, that are leading to these estrogenic effects. It's a serious problem. If we're to be sensible about this, we've got to compare the risk of these molecules and the risk of these products, plastics, against their benefits. And I've talked a lot about the risk here, but I've not really talked about the benefits. Now, I'm not an expert in the benefits here, but I think we just need to put them onto this balance and weigh them up and decide whether the risk is winning or whether the benefit is winning. There are quite a lot of benefits and really important benefits. The first and foremost, I think, is food safety. And packaging of foods is really very important. If we didn't package foods properly, they get contaminated, and they will probably lead to foodborne illnesses. And the incidence of foodborne illnesses would go up if we didn't package food properly. Plastics are very useful for that. So we need to put that into the mix before we all cry out, let's ban plastics. They're, of course, very convenient. And my computer in front of me here is made out of plastics. Nearly everything that we handle somewhere is made out of plastics. They're used for surgical instruments, they're recyclable, etc., etc., etc. You can produce lists and lists and lists of the benefits, but we need to weigh them up against the risks. So perhaps we need to look at environmentally friendly alternatives to some of these uses. So for food packaging, we could use more cardboard, more paper that can actually decompose in the environment. But people will argue against that for other environmental reasons. For surgical instruments, perhaps we could use instruments that could be reused. In parts of the third world, they still do. But there are issues there about cleaning them and whether you can clean them properly and whether they transmit contamination. So it's easy to say environmentally or friendly alternatives, exclamation mark. It's much more difficult to do that in a very safe and beneficial way. So if we look at the risks versus benefits of plastics, I think probably this is very, very superficial. At the moment, the risks are outweighing the benefits. But if we reduce the use of plastics, I think that risk would gently rise so that we could actually use them just for the purpose where they're really very beneficial. Surgical instruments, packaging food, but not for the myriad things that we currently use them for. And in fact, just before I came out this morning, I took a photograph inside my recycling bin, which I'm not going to go through in great detail. But it doesn't take long to see there are a whole load of things in there that we don't really need plastics for. You know, there's a container here that had milk in. We could put it in bottles and send them back. There are issues about re-sterilising, I realise. And there's another container here, and plastic wrapping from the outside of a parcel that came. Does it really need plastic wrapping? Probably not. And you'll also notice, and the New Zealanders amongst you will notice, there are 2 or 3 Monteith's bottles in there, and that's one of the best beers in the world. Thank you very much for listening.